A massive shout out to our sponsor War Thunder, more on them later. Like most Star Wars fans, we here at Geetsly's love cool spaceships. We've made plenty of videos about the cool craft of the Clone Wars era, and to a lesser degree the Imperial era and Golden Age of the Republic. But we haven't spent nearly as much time on Old Republic ships, a grave mistake that we'll begin rectifying today. Today, we're going to be looking at the main capital ships of the various Sith empires, from the Golden Age of the Sith to the end of the Old Sith Wars, examining their designs, capabilities, and effectiveness when compared to contemporary Republic craft. Now, while you can't test out the capabilities of these Sith spacecraft and capital ships, you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships in War Thunder, the sponsor of today's video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. Play for free on PC and consoles. Immerse yourself in intense combat where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. The vehicles in War Thunder span over 100 years of development, from the biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s all the way to the fighter jets and main battle tanks today. The best part is that you don't need any fancy equipment to pilot or drive a tank. You can use just your mouse and keyboard. We're huge fans of War Thunder's 3 distinct game modes, particularly the arcade mode. Sometimes I just want to chill after a long day of producing our full Jedi History series, and War Thunder's arcade mode is perfect to wind my day down with its fast-paced and quick matches. War Thunder takes realism to a whole new level. Every vehicle is modeled down to its individual components, each one vulnerable to damage just like in real-life combat. Whether it's a direct hit to the engine, the ammo storage, or even the crew, every shot has a unique and dramatic impact. Play War Thunder for free using my link in the description or pinned comment. New players and those returning after 6 months get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, and 7 days premium access. Available for a limited time only. Download War Thunder on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox and join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today. First things first, let's have a quick recap of Sith history, so that we understand the context of these ships. The original Sith Empire was established 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin by a group of 12 exiled Dark Jedi who conquered the Sith people of Ziost and declared themselves the Dark Lords of the Sith. For the next 2,000 years, their empire ruled a small corner of space in the Outer Rim, conquering over 100 worlds. The reign of the original Sith Empire came to an end, however, after the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, which saw the Sith go up against the Republic and lose badly. Sith civilization was destroyed in the war's aftermath, and the remnants of the Sith scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy. About 1,000 years later, several Sith factions arose, went to war with the Republic, and fell in short succession. The first was Exar Kun's Brotherhood of the Sith, which took control of various minor military powers and combined their forces with stolen Republic vessels and ancient Sith battleships in a bid to establish a new Sith Empire. They failed, but just a few decades later, they were followed by Darth Revan and Darth Malak, former Jedi heroes who had been put in command of a large chunk of the Republic Navy. They amassed a huge army of Republic defectors and stole or destroyed most of the Republic's larger capital ships, which they used to conquer a third of Republic space. But Revan's Sith Empire was destroyed by infighting just a few years later. The remnants seized what remaining Sith military assets they could and harassed Republic forces in the Outer Rim for the next few years, but they too fizzled out before long. After a few more centuries, a new Sith Empire revealed itself. This empire, the true Sith Empire, had been established in secret shortly after the fall of the first one, and it had been patiently biding its time deep in unknown space, while the Republic was torn apart by other wars. The true Sith spent that time building one of the largest war fleets in history, which they unleashed on the galaxy in the 3600s BBY, beginning the Galactic Wars. In the Galactic Wars, the true Sith came close to total victory on several occasions, but they were eventually defeated as well. By 3000 BBY, the Sith were believed extinct. They saw another resurgence in 2000 BBY as the new Sith, but since we have very little information about the ships used by the new Sith, we're going to be leaving them out of this video. Let's start with the OG Sith Empire. The military forces of this Sith Empire combined force-based and conventional technology. The Sith's Massassi foot soldiers wielded alchemically enhanced bladed weapons and were supported by Sith-spawn war beasts, while in the skies and in space, the Sith relied on conventional warships and starfighters. The Sith Empire's space-borne navies were primarily composed of two classes of capital ship, the first of which was the Derriphan-class battleship. At 215 meters long, these ships were tiny by modern standards, and by the Anaxis War College classification system, they'd be labeled frigates. But at this class's peak in 5000 BBY, it was one of the most fearsome warships in the galaxy. The Derriphan was a long, narrow vessel crowned with sensor masts and ensconced in layers of jagged armor, giving these ships a fearsome appearance. It was slow and lacked maneuverability, but it made up for this with sheer durability. The Derriphan-class battleship was heavily armored, such that it was tougher than contemporary Republic warships, despite the fact that the Derriphan completely lacked shield generators. Even a millennium after their prime, these shieldless vessels proved tough enough to hold their own in the Jedi Civil War. Each of these battleships required a crew of 25 Massassi, and they could carry 5,000 tons of cargo and up to 850 passengers, usually armies of Massassi warriors. They had hangar space for just 2 shuttles and 6 starfighters each, but they made up for their lackluster fighter wings with their firepower. A single Derriphan-class battleship boasted 6 autoblaster batteries, 3 per side. These weapons had subpar accuracy, but an extremely high rate of fire, and they were typically used to create wide fields of fire, dealing serious damage to anything vaguely to either side of the ship. The Derriphan was also armed with point defense laser cannons and a battery of 3 concussion missile launchers on its prow, which had magazines of 60 concussion missiles each. This firepower was enough that, when combined with the Derriphan's heavy armor, it took 6 contemporary Republic warships to bring down just one Derriphan, and the Sith battleship would usually take at least one Republic vessel with it. At the time of the Great Hyperspace War, the Sith Empire had a little over 100 Derriphan-class battleships, though Naga Sadow used Sith sorcery to make it seem like his fleet was much larger. Some of these vessels were also modified, equipped with dark side superweapons, as was the case with Naga Sadow's Derriphan-class flagship, the Corsair. The Corsair's design differed from that of the standard Derriphan-class battleship in a number of ways, but it had most of the same capabilities, with the only noteworthy alteration being its extra weaponry. The ship contained a crystal-based dark side weapon that channeled the effects of Sith sorcery, which could be used to manipulate stars. This weapon could be used to cause solar flares or similar instabilities, and it could even be used to tear out a star's core, causing it to go supernova. The Sith Empire's other major capital ship was the Sith Dreadnaught. We don't have exact stats for this ship's capabilities, but we know that it was a bit larger than the Derriphan, about as heavily armored, and also lacked shields. It was less heavily armed than the Derriphan, as the Dreadnaught wasn't meant to be used as a frontline battleship, but as a carrier. Each Dreadnaught sported 6 large diamond-shaped drop pods along its sides, and in battle, it would fly into a planet's lower atmosphere and deploy all of them at once. The pods would drop down onto the planet's surface and deploy their cargo, either 60 Massassi warriors or 1 Sith warbeast. There was also the Sith escort gunship, which was smaller than a capital ship, but larger than a starfighter. These craft were 75 meters long, required a crew of 18, and primarily served 2 purposes. They could act as elite troop transports, shuttling up to 30 Massassi warriors and 250 tons of cargo to the battlefield, or they could act as fast-moving mini-corvettes, putting their 6 autoblasters to use against enemy capital ships. In the latter capacity, they complemented the more sluggish Derriphan-class battleship, as these gunships were agile and had a decent amount of firepower. The Sith also made use of Sith meditation spheres, spherical ships used by Sith Lords as remote command posts. These eerie vessels resembled large eyeballs with bat-like wings and sensor masts, and being only 10 meters in diameter, they only had room for one person aboard. These vessels were designed according to arcane Sith architectural principles that allowed them to amplify the power of the Force, allowing Sith Lords to better focus their battle meditation or Sith sorcery across whole sectors of space. In their time, the ships of the Sith Empire were fearsome, and they gave the Republic a run for its money in the Great Hyperspace War. However, almost all of them were destroyed in the fall of the Sith Empire, with the notable exception of the Corsair and a single Sith meditation sphere, and the steady advancement of starship technology meant that they had become largely obsolete by the time of the Great Sith War anyway. That war saw a new generation of Sith warships come to the forefront, this time incorporating stolen Republic technology. The Sith of the Great Sith War made use of a diverse array of capital ships with various origins. Among these were Republic Navy ships stolen from the Foremost shipyards that we have little definitive information about, as well as a few old Sith Derriphans and some Mandalorian warships, the latter of which we went over in our video about the Mandalorians. In this section, we'll instead be focusing on the capital ships used by the Krath, the most militarized Sith faction of this era, which made use of a number of warships of a distinctly Teton design. The smallest capital ship in the Krath Fleet, if you could even call it a capital ship, was the Teton assault ship, also known as the Flying Deck. These unique T-shaped vessels were an iconic symbol of the Great Sith War, appearing in vast numbers in the skies above worlds threatened by the Krath Holy Crusade. These ships consisted of a long central hull flanked by two wings to either side of the cockpit, with huge drive engines located at the base of the wings. These ships could operate in space or in atmosphere, and they were apparently fast and well armored. We don't have many exact stats about these ships, but they were equipped with at least 3 laser cannons, probably for point defense, and their primary role was to land on planetary surfaces to disgorge hordes of Krath soldiers and armored vehicles. The Krath deployed these vessels by the hundreds in the Great Sith War, as they spread terror and death all throughout the slice. The Krath also made use of the Teton Corsair, which was a mid-sized ship used to harass shipping and deploy Krath war droids onto target worlds. We know very little about this ship, but it seems similar in design to the larger Supremacy-class attack ship, the mainstay of the Krath Fleet, albeit a bit smaller. Teton Corsairs were presumably armed, but nothing is known of their exact capabilities, apart from the fact that one could deploy dozens of Krath war droids onto a planet via drop pods. The primary Krath warship, as we already mentioned, was the Supremacy-class attack ship. Manufactured by Koros Spaceworks, these ships bore a superficial resemblance to the Derriphan-class battleship, with a long frame topped with sensor masts and lined with jagged strips of armor plate, but these vessels were much larger and much more advanced. At 550 meters in length, the Supremacy-class attack ship was considered a cruiser, and it was decently maneuverable, well armored, and equipped with powerful deflector shields. It required a large crew for a ship of its size, 1,800 personnel in total, of which 52 were gunners. Apart from the crew, the Supremacy could carry up to 3,000 passengers, typically Krath troops or Mandalorian crusaders, and 6,000 tons of cargo. Unlike the Derriphan before it, the Supremacy-class attack ship had a huge starfighter complement for a ship of its time. Each Krath cruiser could carry 8 shuttles and 144 CX-133 Chaos fighters, with the latter being agile, lightweight craft armed with 6 laser cannons and designed for use by a single pilot. Chaos fighters were easy to destroy, but they had considerable firepower and were made much more dangerous by their pilots' fearlessness and suicidal tactics. Chaos fighters were routinely deployed in swarms for kamikaze attacks by Krath commanders, and the craft had modified fuel tanks that were designed to cause maximum damage when they exploded. The hangars of Supremacy-class attack ships could also be modified to store and deploy Basilisk war droids, which the Mandalorians of the era used as spaceborne mounts. Apart from its impressive fighter complement, The Supremacy-class attack ship was armed with 3 tractor beam generators, 10 medium point defense laser cannon batteries, 3 light dual turbo laser batteries, and 3 heavy ion cannon batteries. These weapons were all slightly less advanced than their Republic counterparts, but they nonetheless gave Krath cruisers considerable firepower for the era, helping to make the Supremacy-class attack ship the most feared capital ship of the Great Sith War. The decades following the Great Sith War saw major improvements in capital ship design, particularly before and during the Mandalorian Wars, when the Republic was overhauling its navy. The outdated battleships fielded by the Republic in the Great Sith War were replaced with state-of-the-art, highly efficient Hammerhead-class cruisers and Foray-class blockade runners, which were grouped into large fleets led by massive, inexpugnable class command ships, and during the Mandalorian Wars, these ships were supplemented with new fleets of larger vessels, most notably the formidable Interdictor-class cruiser and Centurion-class battlecruiser. When Darth Revan's Sith Empire declared itself in 3959 BBY, large portions of the Republic Navy immediately defected, bringing many of the Republic's warships with them, and early raids on the Republic shipyards at Foros allowed the Sith to seize nearly all of the Republic's larger vessels, forcing the Republic to rely on its smaller Hammerhead cruisers and Foray blockade runners for the duration of the Jedi Civil War. The Sith, meanwhile, adopted the Interdictor-class cruiser and Centurion-class battlecruisers as the backbone of their new fleet. The Interdictor-class cruiser, also known as the Interdictor-class Sith destroyer, was by far the most common capital ship in the Sith Armada, as the original Interdictors stolen from the Republic were used as templates for thousands of new vessels of the class manufactured by the Starforge. Originally designed by Republic CNR systems, the Sith Interdictor was a highly advanced vessel superior to the Hammerhead-class cruisers the Republic relied on in the Jedi Civil War. At 600 meters in length, the Interdictor was a heavy cruiser under the Anaxis War College classification system, and it had an unusual alien design. The vessel was beak-shaped, with a large upper hull arcing over a small lower hull, which was only connected with the upper hull at the aft end of the ship, where the cruiser's thrusters and dorsal command tower were located. In sharp contrast to the rugged designs of past Sith warships, the Interdictor's hull had a smooth and elegant appearance, and its internal passageways were neat, brightly lit, and spacious. Aesthetic choices and design elements introduced with the Interdictor would go on to see use in the Republic and Imperial warships of later eras, including the infamous Star Destroyer line. The Interdictor boasted impressive speed and maneuverability for a ship of its size, as well as a powerful hyperdrive. It was shielded and well armored, and it ostensibly required a crew of 5,224, though given how mass-produced the vessels were, it's likely that many of the Interdictors produced by the Starforge featured much greater automation or droid crews. Apart from its crew, an Interdictor had room aboard for 3,600 passengers, typically Sith troopers and battle droids, as well as 11,000 tons of cargo, not counting the ground vehicles that could be stored in the vessel's hangars. The Interdictor had a fairly average hangar complement, consisting of 48 starfighters and 2 shuttles. These shuttles were typically either Herald-class shuttles or KT-400 military droid carriers, while the fighters were almost always the standard Sith fighters. These craft were of a unique alien design that combined cutting-edge Republic starfighter technology with Rakatan twin-ion engine designs and other innovations the Sith had gotten from the Starforge, where these fighters were manufactured in vast numbers. Sith fighters were lightweight, extremely fast, and armed with a pair of laser cannons, but they were also fairly fragile and easy for veteran Republic pilots to destroy in droves, much like the later Imperial TIE fighters. Apart from its fighter wing, the Interdictor was heavily armed. It got its name from its 4 gravity well projectors, an experimental technology developed by CNR that gave the Interdictor its name. Sith Interdictors could use their gravity well projectors to interdict hyperspace routes, ripping ships out of hyperspace to either be destroyed or captured. These had allowed the Interdictors to play a major role in the Battle of Duro during the Mandalorian Wars, preventing the Mandalorians from escaping with hordes of stolen war material, and during the Jedi Civil War, they were used to systematically cut off Republic shipping. To facilitate the capture of stricken vessels, the Interdictor also had 3 tractor beam projectors. The Interdictor's other weapons were apparently variable. Interdictor cruisers were armed with at least 6 point defense light laser cannon batteries and 5 medium turbolaser batteries, and most were likely armed with many more. The Leviathan, the most famous Interdictor-class cruiser, had an additional 2 ion cannons, 4 turbolaser turrets, and at least 20 quad laser cannons, according to official sources. These numbers contradict what's seen in the Leviathan's original appearance, however. In KOTOR, the ship had dual turbolasers clustered in 10 groups of 4 along each broadside, as well as at least 16 turret towers, likely housing point defense turrets on its dorsal side. This would imply that the Leviathan, and possibly other Interdictor-class cruisers, had around 30 point defense turrets all told, and 80 dual turbolasers split evenly between its broadsides, which is a truly staggering amount of firepower for a ship of this era. The Sith also made use of what had been the Republic's primary class of command ships during the late Mandalorian Wars, the Centurion-class battlecruiser. These ships were massive for their time at 1,200 meters in length, making them twice as long as the Interdictor-class cruiser and larger than the Venator-class Star Destroyer. By the standards of the Anaxis War College system, the Centurion would be a Star Destroyer, but in its time, it was considered a battle cruiser, and a particularly large one at that. The Centurion was the first known warship to boast the blocky, arrowhead-shaped hull design that would later see use in many famous Republic and Imperial warships, most notably the Destroyer design lineage. The Centurion was decently maneuverable and was both very well armored and heavily shielded. These craft were designed to take a pummeling so that they could go toe-to-toe with the heavily armed flagships of the Mandalorian fleet, and as a result, their durability was truly amazing. One Centurion-class battlecruiser, the Ravager, remained space-worthy after suffering massive hull damage in the Battle of Malachor V, though it was just barely space-worthy, and its owner, Darth Nihilus, had to use the Force to hold it together. The Centurion had an enormous crew of 31,452, though given the history of the Ravager, it seems likely that it could operate on much smaller skeleton crews if need be. It could carry 7,400 troops and 32,000 tons of cargo into battle, allowing these battle cruisers to support ground invasions. Their hangars had room for a variety of shuttles and support vehicles, as well as a wing of 96 Sith fighters, which was twice that of the smaller Interdictor-class cruiser. Of course, as you would expect for a warship this large, the Centurion was also pretty well armed. As with the Interdictor, the official stats for this ship seem lower than indicated in other media though, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. Like the Interdictor, the Centurion had 3 tractor beam projectors, though it lacked the Interdictor's gravity well generators. On top of this, the Centurion had at least 6 light point defense laser cannon batteries, 6 heavy ion cannon batteries, and 6 medium turbolaser batteries. Since most of the Republic's Centurion-class battlecruisers were lost in the Mandalorian Wars, and the Starforge's capital ship dry docks were earmarked for the production of new Interdictor cruisers, these vessels were a rare sight in the Jedi Civil War, deployed only in theaters where Revan believed overwhelming force was necessary. There was one particular Centurion battlecruiser that became particularly notorious as a Sith vessel, however, the Ravager, the flagship of Darth Nihilus. This ship became the flagship of Nihilus's fleet of ghost ships, which terrorized the Outer Rim until their destruction in the Battle of Telos IV in 3951 BBY. For about 300 years after the Battle of Telos IV, the Republic enjoyed a brief break in the old Sith Wars. All that changed in the 3600s BBY, however, when the true Sith Empire revealed itself and went to war against the Republic. In the ensuing galactic wars, the true Sith made use of a vast and diverse fleet of warships they had assembled in their 1,000-year exile from known space. This fleet contained many unnamed vessels, with unknown specifications, but it most notably included 3 capital ships that were the mainstay of the Sith war effort. The ships used by the true Sith were mostly based on stolen Republic technology acquired from Revan's Sith, though they presumably shared a design lineage with the ships of the original Sith Empire, which the true Sith were a fragment of. As a result of their acquired Republic technology and design elements, however, these ships generally resembled those used by Revan's Sith than those used by the ancient Sith, and some even bore a resemblance to the vessels of the later Galactic Empire. The first true Sith vessel worth mentioning is the Terminus-class destroyer. At 500 meters in length, this ship was actually just a cruiser, and it had a long, somewhat narrow hull with aft-mounted sensor masts that could be said to vaguely evoke the older Derriphan-class battleship. The Terminus was the unsung hero of the true Sith fleet, much like the Dreadnaught-class cruiser of later eras. It was smaller, less powerful, and less conspicuous than the Harrower-class Dreadnaught, the most infamous true Sith vessel, but the Terminus could hold its own against most Republic vessels, and it filled a wide variety of roles in the Sith Imperial Navy, particularly patrol and defense, which freed up most of the Harrower-class for use on the front lines. The Terminus required a fairly small crew for a ship of its size, totaling just 520 personnel, and it also had surprisingly little space for embarked troops, with room for just 285 passengers. It had hangars, but they were fairly lackluster, with room for just 3 shuttles, 2 bombers, and 14 starfighters. The true Sith Empire had a wide variety of starfighter types, so the exact composition of the average Terminus' starfighter wing varied, but in most cases, these craft would have been equipped with 14 Mark IV Supremacy-class starfighters and 2 B-28 Extinction-class bombers. The exact armament of the Terminus-class destroyer is unknown, but each vessel boasted a single ion cannon, at least 7 turbo lasers, laser cannon turrets, and concussion missile launchers. The basic design of the Terminus-class destroyer was scalable, and during the Galactic Wars, the true Sith Empire experimented with making smaller and larger vessels based on its design. One example of a larger vessel was the Ascendant Spear, a destroyer classified as a superweapon by the Sith. At 1600 meters in length, this ship was about the size of an Imperial Star Destroyer, and it boasted an incredibly fast hyperdrive and exotic computer systems that allowed a Force user with the right bionic implants to interface with and directly control the ship. The Ascendant Spear only required a crew of 3,000 personnel to operate, which was tiny for such a large ship, and it was heavily armed, bristling with point defense guns, turbo lasers, and ion cannons. Most of its exact specifications are unknown. Another of the true Sith Empire's 3 main warship classes was also based on the Terminus-class, the Gauge-class transport. This ship was smaller and more lightly armed than the Terminus, boasting fewer than 7 turbo laser batteries, but it was faster and had additional cargo and barrack space, as befitting its role as a troop transport and logistical craft. Though the Gauge was generally kept away from the front lines, it was still heavily armored and very durable, and it was known to be particularly well suited for ramming attacks. Lastly, we have the most iconic warship of the true Sith Empire, the Harrower-class Dreadnaught. Manufactured by Tarab Starship Manufacturing, these vessels were heavy cruisers by Anaxis War College standards, and they were the most fearsome ships in the true Sith Empire. Their designs borrowed much from Republic designs like the Centurion-class battlecruiser, at least one of which is known to have been commandeered by the true Sith. The Harrower was flat and angular, vaguely arrowhead-shaped, but with a split, 2-pronged prow, with the cruiser's main hangar portals located between the prongs. 2 additional hangar portals were located in recesses along the sides of the cruiser, while 1 more was located on the Harrower's underbelly. At the warship's aft, above the main drive thrusters, was a short but broad command tower with long wings to either side. There were a bunch of variants of this capital ship active during the Galactic Wars, most of which had only superficial differences from each other. The earliest known variant, seen during the Tinjil Arm campaign, had only a tiny split in its forward prow section, which was mostly obscured beneath layers of armor, giving this variant a more traditional Star Destroyer shape. Another early variant, seen during the Battle of Korriban, introduced the wide split seen in most variants of this ship, and is the type we have the most complete stats for. Later variants had narrower prow structures, rearranged their turrets, or altered the configurations of the forward hangars, but other than this, they all seem to generally have had the same stats, apart from a few specially modified Harrowers. The Harrower was 800 meters in length, decently fast and maneuverable, and both well armored and well shielded, boasting 4 shield generators that protected different parts of the ship. Its hull armoring was heavily reinforced, and it required a crew of just 2,400, half that of the smaller Sith Interdictor. The Harrower also had room for 7,400 troops, making these massive vessels essential for planetary invasions, as they were the only true Sith vessels with enough space to carry and deploy whole armies. In total, the Harrower-class Dreadnaught had 5 hangars, 2 spaced between the vessel's forward prongs, 1 stacked atop the other, 2 on either side of the ship, and 1 located on the warship's underside, which was presumably intended to allow frigate-sized craft to dock with the Dreadnaught. As you might expect from all this hangar space, the Harrower carried a ton of embarked craft, typically 35 shuttles of various classifications, 95 Mark IV Supremacy-class starfighters, and 32 B-28 Extinction-class bombers. This fighter wing was roughly equivalent to that of the Republic Valor-class cruiser, the largest mainline Republic capital ship of the era. As with any Sith warship worth its spice, the Harrower was also armed to the teeth, boasting a considerable number of turbo laser batteries, quad laser turrets, ion cannons, and launch tubes for proton torpedoes and concussion missiles. The number and layout of these weapons varied depending on configuration, and we don't have exact numbers for the Harrower's missile tubes or ion cannons, but visual renders of the ship allow us to count the turbo lasers on at least one variant. This variant of the Harrower had several quartets of dual turbo laser turrets along its broadsides, with 2 sets of 4 along the dorsal and ventral halves of either broadside, a total of 32 dual turbo lasers, all with broadside arcs. The dorsal section of the Harrower also boasted way larger, heavier triple-mounted turbo lasers, with 4 positioned on a forward-firing arc, 16 in 2 rows of 4 with broadside arcs on either side of the command tower, and an additional 5 on top of the command tower, 1 with a forward arc and 4 with broadside arcs. That's 25 of these heavy turbo lasers all told, plus the 32 smaller turbo lasers, which is an absolutely absurd amount of firepower on its own. The True Sith also manufactured a few specialized variants of the Harrower-class Dreadnaughts. 2 of these were just ordinary Harrowers modified to carry superweapons. These variants eliminated the 2 forward hangar sections, presumably lowering the warship's starfighter capacity in exchange for mounting superweapons between the warship's prongs. The 2 superweapons boasted by these ships were called the Silencer and the Gauntlet by their inventors. The former was a mega laser capable of destroying a capital ship with a single shot, with a rapid rechargeability that allowed it to tear up whole fleets of ships, while the latter was a lightspeed cannon capable of eliminating targets in hyperspace. The last specialized variant of the Harrower was the BSX-5 Dreadnaught, a downsized version of the standard Harrower-class Dreadnaught that was only 3/4 of the original vessel's length, or 600 meters. These ships were likely intended for cost cutting, as the Harrower was incredibly expensive to produce, with just 1 Dreadnaught costing the equivalent of 10 years output from a standard Sith mining colony. By and large, the BSX-5 was the same as the standard Harrower, just smaller and with lighter armor, fewer weapons, and less hangar space. The BSX-5 was manned by a crew of 2,000, and in stark contrast to the standard Harrower, it only had room for 1,500 passengers, typically embarked troops. Its hangar space saw a similarly dramatic reduction. The BSX-5 only had room for 2 shuttles and 8 Mark IV Supremacy-class starfighters. The BSX-5 had 2 tractor beams, which the standard Harrower isn't stated to have had, but it was generally much less heavily armed, boasting just 28 turbo lasers and 12 ion cannons. That still made this a pretty formidable ship, but all the same, it was much less effective than its larger cousin. These ships all saw extensive use during the Galactic Wars, as the true Sith made their long-awaited move to conquer the Galactic Republic. But as the Galactic Wars wore on, the true Sith Empire began to fracture. Its vessels started seeing use from a variety of different Sith factions, and eventually their numbers began to dwindle as the Sith once more declined. By 3000 BBY, the true Sith were extinct and their empire was gone. The Republic ruled the galaxy unchallenged, as the Sith had been reduced to fringe cults in the remotest outer rim. The warships of the true Sith Empire faded into obscurity, left behind by centuries of advancements in starship technology. By the time the new Sith Empire came around in 2000 BBY, the warships of the old Sith Empire were considered ancient. The new Sith used warships of their own in their campaigns against the Republic, and though we don't have exact stats for any of them, by and large, they seem to have been based on contemporary Republic technology, with some incorporating designs and Rakatan-inspired elements from the ships of Darth Revan's Sith Empire. So that's our look at the capital ships of the various old Sith Empires. We hope you've enjoyed, and as always, we want to know what you think. What's your favorite Sith warship? Would you like to see a Republic equivalent of this video? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Huge thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play War Thunder for free using my link in the description or pinned comment. New players and those returning after 6 months get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, and 7 days of premium access. Don't miss out, as this offer is available for a limited time only.